Versus code debugging. Can you debug multiple processes? Imagine working on a complex application that runs several parts at once, like a client and server. You might wonder if you can debug all these parts at the same time in Visual Studio Code. Well, the good news is yes, you can. Visual Studio Code does support debugging multiple processes, which is often called multi-target debugging. This feature is especially helpful when you're working with applications that involve more than one process, like a web server and a database or a client and a backend. When you start a debug session in Visual Studio Code, you can launch additional sessions. Once multiple sessions are running, Visual Studio Code enters a multi-target mode. Each process appears as a separate item in the call stack view, making it easier to see what each process is doing. The debug toolbar will show which session is active, and you can switch between sessions using a drop-down menu or by clicking on different call stacks. However, keep in mind that the debugging commands like stepping through code or continuing only apply to the active session. You cannot control multiple processes simultaneously with a single command. You need to switch the focus to the process you want to work on. This means you can inspect each process individually but not in perfect lockstep. To manage this setup, you usually need to configure your debugging environment using a file called launch.json. This file is part of Visual Studio Code's configuration system. You can create a compound configuration that starts multiple debug sessions at once. Each session corresponds to a different process, and you can switch focus between them as needed. It's also worth noting that breakpoints set in one process may automatically apply to new processes if they share the same binary or code base. But if the processes are different, you might need to set breakpoints separately for each one. Managing breakpoints per process is an area that is still being improved in Visual Studio Code's debugging extensions. For languages or runtimes that are not supported natively, you might need to install specific debugger extensions from the Visual Studio Marketplace. Some extensions support remote debugging, which allows you to debug applications running on other machines or environments. For example, Node.js debugging supports remote sessions out of the box, making it easier to work with server-side code. In summary, Visual Studio Code allows you to debug multiple processes by launching several debug sessions and switching between them. You set this up through the launch.json file with compound configurations. While you cannot debug all processes simultaneously in real time, switching focus lets you control each process individually. This setup is very useful for mastering debugging complex applications with multiple processes.